Welcome to Unlocking Bach, audio program notes for upcoming concerts in Music Worcester's The Complete Bach. I'm Artistic Director Dr. Chris Shepard. Join me as we climb into the miraculous mind of Johann Sebastian Bach. Hello and welcome to this Unlocking Bach episode about the Christmas Oratorio. I should probably begin, no matter what time of the year you are listening to this, by saying Frohe Weihnachten und ein gutes neues Jahr, which means Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year in German. I like to say about the Christmas Oratorio, very tongue-in-cheek, that it is neither Christmas nor Oratorio, which is obviously not true because it is about Christmas and it is, in one sense at least, an oratorio. But there are a couple things that are a little different than you might expect. First of all, yes, it is the Christmas story, but it begins even ahead of that with a sense of Advent, with a sense of preparing yourself for the coming baby, and then goes all the way to the end of the story with the Magi. And then in terms of an oratorio, well, I think that particularly in the English-speaking world, we associate an oratorio with Handel, and particularly with Handel's Messiah. And Handel's Messiah and the Christmas Oratorio have a lot of differences, and I've explored those in the past. I think at its most basic level, it's fair to say that an oratorio is simply an unstaged, sacred, or biblical opera. So it is quite like a Baroque opera, but it is not staged. You just stand there and sing it with soloists and a choir and an orchestra. And more important, the texts are sacred and even more specifically from the Bible. Now, a little bit of history about the oratorio. In the German-speaking countries, it started as a Lenten alternative to opera because during Lent, the opera was closed. You would not be able to go to the theater at that point. And in fact, even in the churches, in the Lutheran churches, you didn't even have cantatas. You didn't have what was called concerted music, which means choir with orchestra. So in Germany, because of that tradition, oratorio actually developed alongside opera. So there are so many characteristics. And if you were just to, as we used to say back when we had record players in music history class, to drop a needle, if you were just to play a recording of either an opera or an oratorio from the Baroque era, and you had no idea what the piece was, and it was started somewhere in the middle of a movement, and you didn't speak that language, you probably wouldn't know whether it was opera or oratorio. But what we do know, when we do know the text, is that it will be biblical in nature. And as I said, in the English-speaking world, we think first of Handel as the almost inventor of the oratorio. I'm not going to go into the longer history because it had been around from the 17th and early 18th century in Italy. But I will say this, that for Handel, the oratorio was a musical solution to a commercial problem, whereas in Germany, it was a musical solution to a religious problem, meaning that you couldn't do opera during Lent. Well, for Handel, his opera company had gone bankrupt and he needed a way to make money. So he started to put on concerts, which he charged for, of oratorios, because they didn't need to be staged. So they were much cheaper and could be put together much more quickly. Now for Bach, he, as far as we can tell, wouldn't have known those oratorios by Handel. He did know a piece called the Broca's Passion, but I'm not going to go into that. But just for those of you out there who know that, then you would know that he did know Handel's music and he did know a passion setting that was like an oratorio. But in fact, where we think Bach first encountered the oratorio style that he would come to exemplify was in Lübeck. And you might remember Lübeck, that great port city, Hanseatic League city up in the very top of northern Germany. That was where Bach made his very famous pilgrimage on foot to hear the great Dietrich Buxtehude play organ, but also to put on his very famous concert series that was known as Abendmusik, evening music. And in those Abendmusik concerts, over 5 days, Buxtehude would present an oratorio in 5 parts. Now this is pretty important, and I'll leave that for a second to tell you why that idea of presenting one long piece over 5 nights comes back for this. But what you really need to know for now is that for Bach, the oratorio was liturgical, not performative. It was not about a concert. It was about being within a service. And he wanted to use these oratorios when the church gave him permission to use these longer works to replace the customary cantatas. He put together, I'm not going to say wrote, yes he wrote them, but it's more that he put them together because he used music from older pieces, particularly from secular cantatas. He constructed with new texts 3 different oratorios: the Christmas oratorio, the Ascension oratorio, and the Easter oratorio. Now you can think of the Passions, the St. Matthew Passion, the St. John Passion, you can think of those as like oratorios, but for Christmas, Ascension, and Easter, he used the word oratorio. He put these pieces together in 1734, 1735, so a bit more than a decade after he had been living in Leipzig. And you need to remember, this is when he was starting to be quite disenchanted with his job, and he was no longer churning out those cantatas week after week after week, and he was turning to larger scale projects. So it's not really surprising that he would come up with this idea of these oratorios. The only real difference between a cantata and an oratorio for Bach is the length. The cantatas are about 25 minutes, whereas the Christmas oratorio is nearly 3 hours. But also the narrative thread, that there is that longer story, like the story of the Nativity, that goes all the way through it. Whereas cantatas are not so much narrative as they are reflections on the Bible readings. Now, do you remember a second ago when I talked about the Buxtehude Abendmusik, 5-part oratorio over 5 days? We think that might be how he came up with the idea for the Christmas oratorio to be in 6 parts, and they are essentially, each part is just a cantata, that 25-minute length that you would find in a service. But what he did is he said, let's use these 6 occasions. And they're not all Sundays. I will tell you in a second what they are. Let's use these 6 different church services to reflect on a different part of the story, so that from beginning to end, you have the whole story from Advent through until the adoration of the Magi. So this is what they are. They begin on Christmas Day, December 25th, and that is obviously the birth, but with, as I say, a little bit of that Advent preparation. The first 3 parts are 3 days in a row. Christmas Day, then December 26th is the Annunciation to the shepherds by the angels. And then the next day, December 27th, is the Adoration of the shepherds. Part 4 was written for New Year's Day, which is connected to the circumcision of Jesus and his naming. Part 5 is for the Sunday after New Year's Day, which is the journey of the Magi. And then finally, for January 6th, which is the Feast of the Epiphany, it was about the adoration of the Magi in part 6, that final part. So that is why I very tongue-in-cheek said at the beginning that the Christmas oratorio is neither really fully Christmas nor an oratorio, because it does cover that whole season, the 12 days of Christmas, if you will, and also that it is really 6 cantatas which are then put together in a collection. Remember, I say so often that Bach had this urge towards being encyclopedic. So whether it's putting together all the preludes and fugues in the Well-Tempered Clavier, or this, the Christmas oratorio, he loved his collections. What I want to do in today's podcast episode is to talk to you about the different kinds of music found in the Christmas oratorio. And this will feel quite familiar because these are the same kinds of music that are found in cantatas. But because the story is so familiar to us, I think that it is really useful to use the Christmas Oratorio as a way of learning more about how Bach wrote his vocal music. With the cantatas, it's so often about much more obscure theological stuff. But here in the Christmas Oratorio, you get the story that we know and we see how he reflects on the story. For this, I am going to use part 3. This is that December 27th, the Adoration of the Shepherds. The opening part of that part 3 shows every possible kind of composition that Bach uses in the Christmas Oratorio. And we have a real advantage because, as I've said to you before, if I use a commercial recording, then YouTube may very well flag and take down these episodes. But when I lived in Sydney, my Sydney and Bach Choir and Orchestra did the Christmas Oratorio, so I have a live performance recording, so I can actually play you the real music instead of just at the piano. But I am at the piano, so I will show you some things. I just want to, in a very broad sense, tell you what those different kinds of music are, and then we will use that part 3, that third cantata, to go through them in greater detail. There are 3 broad actors, shall we say, in this particular drama. One is the narrator, who is called the evangelist, and we say evangelist simply because it's the person who wrote whatever gospel is being used, like Luke the evangelist or John the evangelist. And so we have come to use that word evangelist, not just in the Christmas Oratorio, but even more important and more fundamentally in those passion stories. And the evangelist is simply the narrator. But if you think about how the Bible goes, when he narrates the story, there are also characters who speak. For example, in the Passions, you'll find Pontius Pilate and Jesus himself speaking. You also get the crowd, or in this case, the shepherds, or the magi. So the narrative is sung by that evangelist, who is really the narrator, and then you will hear the choir pop in and out as a character. But you will also hear the choir doing some other things. They frame the beginning and often ending of each of these cantatas. In general, in the Christmas Oratorio, each of these 6 cantatas, each of the 6 parts, opens with a chorus of praise. That's not all that different from the cantatas, but here in the Christmas Oratorio, they are especially joyful and praising, as is appropriate for the holiday. As I said, the choir is sometimes the character, whether it is the shepherds or the angels or the magi. And then, as we always or almost always find in a cantata, the choir also sings chorales, hymns. And there are quite a lot of them in the Christmas Oratorio, just as there are quite a lot of them in each of the Passions. The job of the choir in singing the chorale is to represent the congregation. We don't think that the congregation sang along with these versions, but in general, the congregation did sing these hymns, these chorales. They were very well known, and chorales, hymns, as we say in English, but for the Lutheran Church, we say chorale from that period. These chorales were such an important foundational part of the Lutheran Church. So let's go now to that third cantata, the third part of the Christmas Oratorio, and see those different types of characters and music, the evangelists, the choir and what they do, the soloists and what they do. As I said, so many of these cantatas open with a chorus that is simply a song of praise. I also said that Bach reused music from earlier cantatas, and here is a perfect example of that. In the first year of the complete Bach, the Worcester Chorus performed a couple of cantatas, secular cantatas, meaning not sacred, but for the world, as it were. And these 2 cantatas were written for the King of Saxony to celebrate different things. BWV 215, for example, was written to celebrate the crowning of Augustus III, who was the Elector of Saxony, as the King of Poland as well. That cantata opened with a chorus, the text of which was, Praise your good fortune, blessed Saxony, since God upholds the throne of your king. And this is what that opening sounded like. Very festive. As you'll hear in a second, it features 3 trumpets and timpani, and the use of those trumpets is often a reference to kingship, in this case, Augustus III. It is also in clearly a dance-like rhythm. The meter is 3-time. It happens to be 3/8 here. And the use of one of those French dance forms is often a reference to the French court of Louis XIV, the French court of Louis XIV at Versailles. Again, a reference to kingship. And that made great sense, didn't it, when this was a cantata for the King of Saxony? Well, Bach took exactly the music. The orchestra, I'm playing the orchestral introduction, and then the choir comes in, and all he did was to change the words. And the words now are, "Ruler of heaven, may our feeble songs please you when your Zion exalts you with psalms." So keeps that sense of kingship which we hear in the use of the trumpets and the dance form from Versailles, but this time the king is not the king of Saxony in Dresden, but the king of heaven. This is classic in the Christmas oratorio and even in those other, the Ascension and Easter oratorios, the reuse of perfectly good music that otherwise would only have been performed once. Remember, I have said from the beginning, and I keep making this point, that Bach was as much an artisan as he was an artist, a craftsman who knew the value of his own creation. So that's one thing that the choir does. It frames the entire cantata opening with that song of praise. And by the way, weirdly, it's the only example of this. Bach chooses in this third cantata, which was written for December 27th, the Adoration of the Shepherds, he chooses to close that cantata by repeating the whole first movement. You'll hear a little bit later, it's not actually a particularly long first movement. But for now, instead of hearing the whole movement, I just want you to hear that opening orchestral ritornello introduction into the choir singing. It's very straightforward. There are individual lines, tenor, soprano, alto lines, but then by and large, the choir sings together as a block. So let's listen to that recording by the Sydneyan Bach Choir and Orchestra, my choir from Sydney, Australia, in this live performance from 2005, the opening of Part 3 of the Christmas Oratorio. So that is the opening, the framing chorus, the song of praise for the third part for December 27th. But we've got to resume this story. And the story resumes with the evangelist, that tenor soloist, continuing by singing these words. And as the angels went to heaven, the shepherds said to one another, ... So this is clearly just the first half of a sentence, but let's take this first. The evangelist recitatives, and just like that sounds, it is like reciting the text. It is very, very much bound up in the text. It's not about a meter or even a rhythm. It's about the flow of the language. The evangelist is accompanied only by continuo, which in this case is organ and cello, just playing chords to set him up. And as you hear at the end, it does get into a rhythm here. Sprachen die Hirten untereinander. And that's because we're going to go on to the chorus of shepherds. But leave that for 1 second. Why don't you listen to our evangelist from 2005, Luke Redmond, sing this tiny little recitative. And as you'll hear, it's not about rhythm, it's about the text itself. What do the shepherds say to one another? How do we finish that sentence? They say, "Let us go now to Bethlehem." Let me show you the different elements. I love this little chorus. The bass line, the continuo, does this. Pum 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 pum. Very much a walking bass. So that's the journey itself. And the shepherds sing that text, "Let us go now to Bethlehem. Lasset uns nun gehen gen Bethlehem." The tenors start it by singing this. Lasset uns nun gehen gen Bethlehem. It's very solid, decisive. We are going to make this journey. And it is going up, it is ascending. It works really nicely with that walking bass line. So they really sound like they know what they're doing, right? Well, let me tell you something. I'm a shepherd, so I'm allowed to say this. Shepherds are not known for being very smart. They are out there by themselves for weeks on end, probably stinking, encountering no other human beings. They're not known for being all that bright. So the way that Bach shows this, I think, is hilarious. The tenors sang, the basses sing this, Lasset uns nun gehen gen Bethlehem. In music theory, we refer to this as contrary motion. Tenors up, basses down, and is quite literally contrary motion. The tenor shepherds are walking off in the east, the bass shepherds are walking off towards the west, the sopranos come in, they decide to go along with the tenors. It's a lovely little pun on the idea of shepherds. And what glues it all together? Listen to the flutes and the first violins playing in unison above all of it. Isn't that wonderful? This sparkling, effervescent, and this sparkling, it could mean the star in the sky, couldn't it? It could mean the angels flying away as well. Listen to that recording of the Sydneyan Bach Choir, just the first half of this little fugue, and you will hear those elements. The shepherds going off in different directions, the bass line being that journey itself, and those upper treble instruments glittering as a star. Here you go. In fact, that is not the end of the sentence. The evangelist said the angels went from heaven and the shepherds said to one another, and they say, "Let us go now to Bethlehem," but there is an and. Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing the Lord has made known to us. Bach lets go of that pun and in a sense actually continues to illustrate the idea, but because it is what God has made known, then it's all in the same direction. This is that text, the way that he sets "und die Gesichter sehen," to see this thing. Tenors, bass, und die Gesichter sehen. So we get unanimity of direction, very different from the shepherds going in all these different directions. Here they're saying, oh wait, we know what to do because this is what the Lord said to us to do. So listen to the second half of that chorus. Unlike the evangelist who tells the story, the solo singers comment on the story itself, and they do that in two ways. One, obviously, is the aria, and we are so used to how arias work that I'm barely even going to talk about that. But there is another kind of recitative. So the tenor sang that recitative where the keyboard and the cello just play chords. They often don't hold them even. They just sort of set a chord down just to provide a little bit of structure. But then there is a recitative that is called an accompanied recitative, or in Italian, accompagnato. And here is the difference. First of all, it is accompanied by more than just by the continuo and has other instruments. In this case, he uses the flutes, and I'll tell you why in a second. But even more important, there is rhythm to it. This is what the bass soloist sings after the shepherds. Hat sein Volk getröst, hat sein Israel erlöst. You see straight away that there's a rhythm to it. It's not a melody. That's why it's still called a recitative. There's no melodic line to it. There is contour and shape, but there isn't a proper melody. And the reason for that is that it is not poetry. It continues to be more like prose. And the text here, so the shepherds say, let us go to Bethlehem and see this thing the Lord has made known to us. And then in an aside to the audience, the bass breaks in and said, he has comforted his people. He has rescued his Israel, sending help out of Zion and ending our sorrow. Look, shepherds, he has done this. Go, this is what awaits you. So in the middle of the story itself, imagine that there is that usual concert setup with the choir and the orchestra and the evangelist out front, or maybe even in a pulpit reading as if he's reading the Bible story. But then down stage left, there is a spotlight that suddenly shines on a single soloist, and he breaks in to talk to the shepherds, and in a sense, talking to us. He says, shepherds, go for what awaits you. And the corollary to that is he's saying to us in the audience, we, like shepherds, should go to Bethlehem and see what awaits us. So I said I'd tell you about the instruments. This is really lovely. He just uses the flutes. Remember that the flutes and the violins were playing in unison. Here, he drops the violins. It's just a pair of flutes. And they hold long notes. And that is very typical in accompanied recitatives, is that they are chords like in the secco, the dry recitative, but they hold them. And why the flute? Because again, it's that sighting of the star, because it is the star that guides the shepherds and the star that guides us. Let's listen to that little bit, that accompanied recitative. I'll play coming out of the chorus because it comes straight out of the shepherds in chorus singing right ahead of it. And this is soloist Tim Collins in this accompanied recitative. From the beginning of Lutheranism, Martin Luther himself made chorales, those hymns, to be the very center of worship. They were sung by the congregation, and over the centuries, these congregations would have known many, many hymns and many, many verses. In these major works, like the Passions and the Oratorios, we think that the choir sang on their own. The congregation would have recognized it and would often even be following a libretto, but probably didn't sing alongside, partly because the harmonies are quite complex and really sophisticated. But it's just the same old chorale that we know. We know their function. In cantatas, for example, they often are the summing up, the corporate reflection at the end of the cantata. In the Christmas Oratorio, they actually are sprinkled throughout, as they are with the Passions as well. This text here is quite simple. All this he has done for us to indicate his great love. For this, all Christianity rejoices and thanks him for it in eternity. So it is the audience's reflection. The choir sings on behalf of them, but it's the audience's, the believers, the parish's reflection on the story of what God has given them through the baby in the manger. So listen to a little bit of that chorale. Immediately you get the idea. It's very typical, 4-part harmony. Yes, it's complicated because it's Bach, but it is straightforward. Listen to the start of that chorale. This is a very typical format for the Christmas Oratorio, that you begin one of those sections with a song of praise, then the evangelist picks up the story. There may be a chorus of shepherds. Later we have a chorus of the Magi, for example. We have a soloist reflecting in a recitative, in one of those accompanied recitatives, and we have a chorale. These little vignettes, which are like opera scenes, contained sections. We find these throughout the Christmas Oratorio. In fact, we find them throughout the Passion stories as well. Following the chorale, there is a beautiful duet for soprano and bass. As I said, I'm not really going to talk to you about arias. We've done so much work about arias. You know how they work. But what I really want to do, instead of going on to the duet, is to finish this episode of Unlocking Bach by quite uncharacteristically playing that whole section that we just talked about. We're able to do that because it's not a commercial recording, so you can get a sense of how that whole scene works. That opening chorus, followed by the evangelist with the chorus of shepherds, the bass singing a short reflection accompanied just by those 2 flutes in continuo, and then it's brought together and ends the scene with that chorale. Those chorales in these major works are often signposts, as if to say this is the end of one section and the story will continue after it. Let's listen then to the opening of Part 3, the 3rd cantata of the Christmas Oratorio. that's it. That is as good an introduction to the Christmas Oratorio and what it has as constituent parts as any I can think of. Do come to our performance. We are going to be doing the first, third, and fifth cantatas within the Christmas Oratorio, and then in another year or two we'll do 2, 4, 6. We are also featuring, and I didn't even cover that in this particular episode, but the extraordinary bass baritone soloist Kevin Diaz will be singing one of Bach's most beloved and beautiful solo cantatas, 82 Ich habe genug. You can read about that online. I've written some program notes we will make available. But for now, steep yourself in the Christmas Oratorio. We are a little out of season by performing this towards the end of January, but we can stretch. We don't need the 12 days of Christmas. We can go with 24, right? In the meantime, keep listening to Bach, and we will yet again, next time, climb into that miraculous mind. Thank you so much.